I'd like to ask you a little bit about how you got into this idea of the kind of person who could do this kind of mission and why that became kind of an organizing principle for the story.
So we have the ISS, right? And we have the space shuttle missions. That's about 200 miles up. And in the ISS, your field of vision is still essentially mostly planet Earth. Huge difference, apparently, psychologically, when you're standing on the moon's surface and you see the Earth as a separate, fairly small blue dot. In fact, we made it a little larger than it should be in the movie when Donald Sutherland points it out because it was too small, really, to make any impact. So sorry. But what's interesting is if you look at what happened to the 12 guys who walked on the moon, Neil Armstrong basically retreated to his farm in Lebanon, Ohio. You never heard from him again. Buzz Aldrin very publicly dealt with real problems of depression and abuse, substance abuse. Charlie Duke became a born-again Christian minister. Edgar Mitchell started talking about aliens and magic men who would fix his pancreas. Something happened. And we had come across a piece, I want to say it's 2011, where it was talking about 4 people for a Mars mission, which they're hoping is 2033. 4 people who would be in an area for 2 years that's maybe half the size of this stage here. And they were looking for people who had kind of what we might call schizoid personality disorder, because, or sort of on the spectrum, because quote unquote normal people, it's more difficult to be in a space like that for that length of time. They wanted to find people who were very much okay by being by themselves. But what they found is, testing all of this, psychological profile testing, they call it, the most horrible torture is solitary confinement, some form of solitary confinement where you don't have the option to leave. And
kind of like prisons.
Yes, like prisons. And there's actually some debate. I think it was Justice Breyer, although I could be wrong about this, who's recently sort of come out and said that solitary confinement is cruel and unusual punishment to try and make it unconstitutional. But if you think about it, some guy or woman or going to Neptune for that length of time, that's prime, you're ready for mental breakdown. There's no doubt about it. So we were just trying to say, really, we're not built to be there. It's not hospitable, and it's the inevitable outcome is that kind of breakdown, I think.
Ethan, when you're starting to write, at what point do you come up with this idea of the psychological evaluation, that you have this moment in the story where you actually get to hear the characters talk about how they're feeling and what they're feeling, that becomes kind of a touchstone throughout the film, this check-in about what kind of person this is and how he's dealing with the situation he's into?
When was that? That was pretty early because we realized he'd be alone a lot of the time and would have to check in with his feelings, and the only way we could really know it would be through the psychological evaluation. This was before we, I think, wrote any voiceover and decided to voiceover. So voiceover obviously is the other technique for that.
But didn't we talked about VO as the extension of the psych evals, right? That was the first sort of iteration of them, which was like the psychological profile thing that you just asked about. They were doing it to the Mercury astronauts, not to a computer obviously, but doing heavy attempts to sort of figure out what their profile was. And we came across that. I don't remember where, but anyway. It seems like you remember more than I do. I don't know.
And it's obviously intentional in watching the film, the idea of that as somebody's trying to look inward, he is looking outward, that you are having this interpersonal journey set against this huge backdrop. Obviously, you realize that on some obvious level, but at what point do you try to have those two ideas playing off each other?
That's a good question.
Well, the idea that we talked about that makes it interesting is the further away he goes from Earth it enables him to get into touch with what he should have been in touch with on the Earth. Only by leaving everything does he see it for the first time, really.
Yeah, the idea was the contrast of it, you know what I mean? That in some sense, as far out as you can go, the edge of the solar system is the way that you can kind of I mean, you only miss something when you don't have it. That was the idea.
And
of it anyway.
it's almost like the converse of the profile of the astronaut who might have gone to space and then something broke and then come back. He almost was broken already.
Right.
And then so it was the opposite thing that happened to him. The same trait that makes somebody willing to leave Earth for years and years, that shows a great deal of courage, but it also might show a big flaw or a big pain that needs to be reconciled.
I want to ask you about the smaller things too, and about editorial, because there are scenes like, I'm thinking about the general scene and the Lima Project conversation about editing dialogue as opposed to action, and whether or not in some ways that might be more time consuming in terms of figuring out what the edit's going to be, and if you have as many spirited conversations about how you're cutting dialogue as opposed to cutting action.
I honestly have to say that dialogue scenes, drama scenes are more challenging. I find action scenes to be fun. They are challenging in and of themselves, but they seem to come together. You know if it's working or not working. Dialogue scenes are so much in nuance and subtext. And so you mentioned the general scene. I think that was largely an expository scene that sets our hero off on his journey. And that I think we just worked from the first day of post-production to the last day.
But that's a really important scene to talk about, because I think one of the accomplishments of James's film, I think, is that it conforms to some familiar tropes, but it's not iterative, I think, of them. So, in that scene, it's a disaster movie situation, right? Someone's threatening the world. Someone's got to do something about it. It's this guy. But it doesn't present in that form. It presents in some other form. There are other things going on. There's a paranoid aura to it. I think it was brilliantly constructed, and I think that's an example of the fine kind of alchemy that this film was able to achieve, where it has scale, it has scope, but it doesn't feel like it's one of those. It feels like its own film, and I think it was brilliantly handled by James and his team.
Alan, what were the initial conversations about where your expertise was going to guide some of the decisions that James was going to make with the camera, and the things that he wanted to represent, given that he wanted to shoot as much practically as possible in a movie that inevitably had a lot of visual effects?
Actually, I think the first conversation was he wanted to shoot on 16 millimeter.
Is that true?
It was, yeah.
It's 100% true. I'm owning up to it. What do you mean? I thought it would look great, and then Alan went, that's a ridiculous idea. You can't do that. All right, take it away, Al. Go ahead, humiliate me. I'm fine.
So we settled on 35. So it's okay. But it does. Everything that James wants to do, we always try and strive for shooting some sort of element so that it's not a full digital shot, and we try and reserve those for the ones we actually have to do. It always lends a sense of realism to the shots, and I think that the more you do with that, and the more elements you composite together, the better the final result will be.
You try to do as much as practically as you can. And you try to add, right, we definitely did this, add some kind of analog idea to every shot, even if it's digital. You add a flare of some kind, something to trick the eye. Because even sometimes you see high-res photographs from the ISS or something, they kind of look fake.
Because they're too perfect.
They're too perfect.
There's
you have
not
to
any defects.
Exactly. And we don't understand that kind of perfection, at least I don't.
Well, I think also, I think what you guys are able to achieve is keep this film very earthbound, where it never kind of falls into that like highly synthetic, almost, what's the word? Where you're watching something that isn't connected to our reality, that feels like it's
An Avengers movie, maybe?
No,
I'm sorry.
I would never. No, I just think there is a grammar in science fiction that tends to privilege futurism, things that are not, maybe that don't feel mundane. And I think there's a tremendous sense of the mundane and the ordinary throughout the visual effects process, which I think accounts for why there's a depth of feeling to the film.
This is a movie that is produced by you and Dee Dee and a certain actor named Brad Pitt. And I'm curious about how Brad came onto the project and what kind of dynamic or challenge that presents when the actor is also the producer, and how you guys talk about that, what's right for the company, what's right for Brad, and when are they the same thing?
Well, Brad and James have known each other for many years, have always talked about working together. There was a discussion about Lost City of Z. Brad then saw Lost City of Z, and he and James talked about this next project, which I think really touched Brad in a deep way as an artist and as an actor, and I'm grateful that our company was invited to produce it alongside a bunch of other great producers, Anthony Katagis, who couldn't be here tonight, but has produced a bunch of James's other films as well as other films with us, and actually a Brazilian company that underwrote some of the original development but maintained an involvement, RT Features, and so as far as Brad's involvement, I mean, I think you can tell from the film that it feels like a very personal film. It's a very courageous, I think, performance, and a very very kind of understated and yet also very bold and daring performance. This sort of producing, acting, conflict or not, or managing all that, I think it's something that our company has done for a while. I think Brad has inherently enormous respect for filmmakers, and respecting their vision, and sees himself in that context in just like a core way. I think that in this film, there is, I think, a harmony of actor and producer. It's hard to really describe why that would be or how that is. I guess it's not always that way, but I feel that I think that you can tell that it was him in functioning in those capacities, and yet it's still inside of and driven by this highly original science fiction vision, which we're used to seeing aliens either as kind of mortal enemies that are going to destroy everybody, or some kind of benevolent beings that are going to teach you how to be. And I think James found this vision that he projected, in which we do something else, and I think that's something that's really, really difficult to pull off, and he did.
Alan, John, Jeremy, Ethan, James, thanks for bringing us your film and for talking about it.
John.